It was a quiet evening in a small mountain valley, where the sun dipped behind tall peaks and painted the sky in deep orange shades. The forest was calm, filled with the soft sound of wind moving through the trees. In a small wooden cabin, a man lived alone. His life was simple. He gathered herbs, fixed old tools, and traded small things in the nearby village for food. He didn't have much, but he was at peace with it. That evening, as he walked back from the woods carrying a basket of herbs, something strange caught his attention. A deep sound like a distant rumble came from the far side of the mountains. At first he thought it was thunder, but then the ground shook lightly beneath his feet. The sound grew louder, followed by what felt like a roar, long, powerful, and filled with pain. He froze in place. The mountains had many stories, about monsters, spirits, and dragons that once ruled the skies. He never believed them, but tonight, something told him those old stories might not be lies after all. He looked toward the noise, feeling both curious and afraid. The roar came again, weaker this time, like something hurt and struggling. Against his better judgment, he set down his basket and began walking toward the sound. The air grew warmer the closer he went, and the smell of smoke drifted in. His heart pounded faster. Still, something deep inside him whispered, "Someone needs help." After climbing a narrow, rocky path, he reached an open area near the cliffside. What he saw made his heart nearly stop. Lying in the middle of the field was a creature so large it made the trees around it look like grass. Its scales shone faintly under the fading light, silver and dark blue but stained with blood and ash. One of its wings was torn badly, bones visible through ripped skin. Its tail lay limp and smoke rose from the ground around it. It was a dragon. He stood frozen, unable to breathe. Dragons were said to be the most dangerous creatures to ever exist. Legends told that their fire could melt stone, their claws could crush walls. People feared even the mention of them. And yet this one didn't look like a monster. It looked broken, wounded, dying. The man took a step back, ready to run, but then he noticed the dragon's eyes. They weren't wild or angry. They were half-closed, filled with pain and exhaustion. Its breathing was uneven, each inhale sounding like thunder echoing in a hollow cave. He could see the creature struggling to move, trying to lift its head but failing. He hesitated for a long moment. His mind screamed at him to go home, but his heart refused to move. Slowly, he took a deep breath and whispered to himself, "It's alive. It's suffering. If I leave it, it will die alone." He moved closer, step by step, careful not to make sudden sounds. The dragon's golden eyes flickered open for a moment, and a low growl escaped its throat. Not loud enough to scare him away, just a warning. He raised both hands slowly, trying to show he wasn't a threat. "I won't hurt you," he said softly, even though he knew the creature couldn't understand his words. "You're hurt. I can help." He saw the torn wing clearly now, deep cuts that were bleeding slowly. There were burn marks too, maybe from another dragon or some kind of explosion. He guessed it had been in a fight. The edges of the wounds had dirt and stones stuck inside, which meant it had been struggling on the ground for hours. If he did nothing, the infection would soon end its life. He ran back to his cabin, grabbed a pot of water, some clean cloth, and herbs he used for treating animals. He didn't know if human medicine would work on a dragon, but he had to try. When he returned, the dragon hadn't moved much. It just watched him with slow, tired eyes, as if trying to understand why a fragile human would come back. He started by cleaning the wound carefully, pouring water over the torn scales and wiping away the dirt. The dragon flinched, releasing a deep groan of pain that made the air tremble. I know, he murmured gently. "It hurts, but I have to do it." He spoke softly, his voice calm and steady, not to soothe the creature, but to stop his own hands from shaking. When he touched the wing, he felt the heat of its body radiating like a furnace, yet there was something strangely peaceful about it. He applied a mix of crushed herbs and wrapped what parts he could with strips of cloth, though the creature was too big for him to cover completely. Night fell, and the moon rose. The dragon hadn't attacked. It just watched him in silence. Once its massive eye blinked slowly, not in threat but almost like acknowledgement. He built a small fire nearby, not for warmth but for light. He sat beside the creature, watching it breathe, listening to its deep rumbling breaths that echoed through the forest. For the first time, he realized how alive this being truly was. It wasn't some evil monster from tales. It was just another creature of nature, wounded and afraid, trying to survive. As dawn approached, the dragon tried to move its wing again, but winced. He saw the effort and said quietly, "Don't move yet, rest. You'll need time." He didn't know why he talked to it like that. Maybe because he was lonely, or maybe because it felt right. The next few days he kept coming back. He brought water, food, mostly fish and raw meat from the river. The dragon didn't eat at first, but after 2 days it accepted a small piece. It felt like a miracle to him. He started to see small changes. The bleeding stopped, the breathing became smoother, and sometimes the dragon lifted its head to look at him properly. The fear between them slowly faded. He even laughed once when the dragon accidentally sneezed smoke and burned a patch of grass near his feet. "You almost got me there," he said, smiling nervously. Each evening he sat nearby, speaking softly while the dragon rested. He told stories of the valley, of how people once believed dragons were guardians before humans feared them. He didn't know if the dragon understood, but sometimes it tilted its head slightly as if listening. Days turned into weeks. The dragon's wing healed enough for it to stretch again. It began to test its strength, beating the air slowly, each movement shaking the trees. On the final morning, he knew it was ready. He stood at a distance as the creature looked at him one last time. For a moment, everything around went still. The wind, the trees, even the birds. Then, with a powerful roar, it spread its massive wings and lifted off the ground. Dust and leaves flew everywhere as it rose higher and higher, circling above the valley. The man watched, his heart full of emotion. The dragon didn't leave right away. It hovered for a few seconds, then made a slow, graceful turn and roared again. Not a sound of anger, but something that almost felt like gratitude. Then it vanished beyond the clouds, leaving only silence behind. He stood there for a long time, eyes fixed on the empty sky. He didn't know if he'd ever see it again. But deep inside he felt something change, a strange connection that words couldn't describe. That day he realized that even the fiercest creature could carry a heart, and sometimes all it needed was a small act of kindness to remind it that not everything in the world was cruel. From that day forward, he often looked up at the mountains when the wind blew strong, half expecting to see a shadow flying above. He didn't know that this act of kindness would one day return. The mornings in the valley were colder now. Mist rolled down from the mountains like soft white waves, wrapping everything in silence. Each day began the same, with the man walking through the wet grass carrying a bucket of water and a small bag of herbs. But his destination was not the village anymore. It was the old cliffside, where a dragon rested quietly under a large rocky shelter. He had grown used to the sight now, though every time he saw the creature, he still felt that same mix of awe and fear. The dragon was healing slowly but surely. Her once torn wing now showed faint scars where new scales had started to grow. The burns had faded, and though her movements were still heavy, she no longer looked like she was dying. When he reached her side, she opened one golden eye and blinked slowly, almost as if to say she recognized him. He placed the water near her and sat down, breathing hard from the climb. "You're looking better today," he said softly. The dragon made a low humming sound, deep and calm, before resting her head again. The first few days had been the hardest. She didn't trust him. She growled every time he came close, and the air around her smelled of smoke and heat. But the man didn't give up. He spoke in a calm voice even when fear tried to pull him back. He told her what he was doing, washing her wounds, applying crushed herbs, or covering the burns with cool leaves. He didn't know if she understood, but he felt it helped. One afternoon, as he cleaned the edge of her wing, she suddenly flinched. Her tail swung and hit the ground so hard that stones rolled down the hill. He stumbled back, nearly falling, but instead of running, he raised both hands. "It's okay," he whispered, his voice trembling but steady. "I won't hurt you." For a moment, the dragon's eyes locked with his. The golden iris narrowed, then softened. Slowly, she lowered her head again, allowing him to continue. From that day on, she never moved violently when he touched her. It was as if she had decided to trust him, at least a little. Each day became part of a quiet rhythm. He would gather herbs in the morning, mix them into pastes, and spend hours cleaning and treating her wounds. He learned what sounds made her calm, what gestures she understood. When she made a low, deep rumble, he knew it meant she was comfortable. When her eyes darted away or her tail twitched, it meant she was restless or afraid. Sometimes he brought her food, fish from the river or the meat of an animal that had died naturally in the forest. At first she refused to eat, She turned her head away and closed her eyes. But after a few days of his gentle persistence, she began to accept small portions. He watched as she carefully picked the food with her claws, never attacking, never showing hostility. The man began to notice other things too. The dragon's scales shimmered differently depending on the light, silver in the morning, dark blue under the moon. Her breath, though heavy, carried a faint warmth that spread through the cold air like fire in winter. And her eyes, they weren't empty. They were full of thoughts, emotions, maybe even questions. He started talking to her more, not because he expected a response, but because it felt right. "I used to think dragons were just stories," he said once while pressing herbs onto her wing. "But now I see you're real and not like the stories say. You're not evil. You're just alive." The dragon's tail moved slowly, brushing the ground near his feet. He smiled faintly. "You know, maybe you're listening. Or maybe you just like the sound of my voice. Either way, I'll keep talking." As days turned into weeks, the valley began to change. Birds that had once vanished returned, flying freely around the cliffs. The forest felt alive again. It was as if the dragon's slow recovery brought new energy to everything around her. The man noticed it too. He felt stronger, more purposeful. His days were no longer quiet and lonely. Sometimes when he worked late into the night, he would look up and see her eyes glowing faintly in the dark. It didn't scare him anymore. It felt like someone was watching over him, protecting him even as he helped her heal. One cold evening, he brought a small blanket and a bowl of warm broth for himself. He sat near the fire he had built beside the dragon, sipping slowly. The dragon shifted slightly, resting her chin near the flame's edge. He chuckled softly. "You like the warmth too, huh?" he said. She exhaled, and a small spark escaped her nostrils, making the fire dance higher. He laughed quietly, shaking his head. "I guess you don't need my fire, do you?" The dragon blinked slowly, and for a moment he swore she understood the joke. There were moments of tension too. Once a group of villagers came near the mountain, searching for herbs. When they saw the dragon from afar, they screamed and ran back, spreading fear across the valley. They warned others that a monster lived in the cliffs. The man tried to calm them, saying the creature was injured and harmless now. But no one believed him. They warned him to stay away, saying one day the beast would burn him alive. He didn't argue. He just smiled sadly and said, "If she wanted me gone, I'd already be gone." He continued his visits quietly, avoiding being seen. The bond between him and the dragon grew stronger with every passing day. When he arrived, she no longer pretended not to notice. She lifted her head, watching him walk up the slope with calm eyes. Sometimes she even made a soft sound that almost felt like a greeting. The man began to notice small changes in her behavior. She practiced moving her wings, lifting them gently to stretch the healing muscles. Her fire returned, controlled, soft, and no longer painful to her. When the wind blew, she would spread her wings and let the breeze flow through them, like she was remembering what it felt like to fly. One day, he stood a little farther away, watching her movements. "You're almost ready," he said quietly. "Not yet, but soon." That night, as he packed his things to leave, he heard a low rumble behind him. He turned to see the dragon watching him intently. Her eyes glowed softly under the moonlight. For a brief moment, she lowered her head until it was just a few steps away from him. The warm air from her breath brushed against his face. He didn't move. He stood there in silence, looking back at her. Then, without thinking, he placed a hand gently on one of her large, cool scales. It was rough, hard like stone, yet somehow alive beneath his touch. The dragon stayed still, her breath deep and steady. In that silent moment, a strange understanding passed between them. She, the most feared creature on earth, and he, a simple man with nothing to offer but kindness. It didn't need words. It was a bond born from trust and care. When he finally walked back down the hill, he turned once more to look at her. She was resting, eyes half closed, wings slightly open. The stars reflected off her scales like tiny sparks. The man smiled faintly. "Sleep well, my friend," he whispered. "You'll fly again soon." As he disappeared into the forest, the dragon lifted her head and released a soft, low sound, one that echoed gently across the valley. It wasn't a roar of power or fear. It was something softer, almost peaceful, like a thank you carried on the wind. That night, as he lay in his small cabin, the man couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about that sound, about her eyes, and about how strange it felt to care so deeply for something the world called dangerous. But in his heart he knew, sometimes the things people fear the most only need someone brave enough to see them differently. He had saved her life. But in a way he didn't yet realize, she had begun to save his too. After many weeks of care and patience, the dragon's wounds had finally healed. The once torn wing now spread wide and strong, shimmering under the morning light like waves of steel blue glass. She was no longer weak or in pain. The fire in her chest had returned, and her golden eyes no longer looked tired or afraid. The man stood quietly on the edge of the cliff that morning, watching her. The wind blew hard, pulling at his coat and hair, while the dragon stood at the edge of the rocks, stretching her wings for the first time in months. He could feel the air tremble as she moved them slowly, testing their strength. "You're ready now," he said softly, even though he knew she couldn't understand his words. "It's time." The dragon turned her head, looking down at him. Her eyes held something deep, a kind of silent gratitude. She lowered her neck until her head was almost level with him. He reached out and placed his hand gently on one of her cool scales, smiling faintly. Then, without warning, she lifted her wings fully and pushed off the ground with an incredible force. The wind burst around him, making him step back and cover his face. Dust and leaves spun everywhere as she rose into the air, higher and higher, her wings cutting through the clouds like silver blades. He looked up, unable to speak, his eyes following her until she became nothing more than a shadow against the bright sky. She circled once, just once, before disappearing beyond the mountains. The silence that followed was strange. For so many weeks he had grown used to her presence, the heavy sound of her breathing, the warmth of her body, the soft rumble that filled the air when she slept. And now all of that was gone. For a long time he just stood there staring at the sky. He felt happy and empty at the same time. He had helped her live, helped her fly again. That was enough. Yet somewhere deep inside he already missed her. Days passed, then weeks. The valley went back to its old rhythm. Birds sang, the wind blew softly, and the forest felt peaceful again. The villagers who had once been afraid stopped talking about the dragon. They said it was gone forever, that the beast must have found another land to rule. But the man didn't think that way. Every morning he stepped outside and looked toward the mountains. Sometimes he thought he saw something move in the clouds, like a shadow gliding above the peaks. He told himself it was just his imagination, but his heart always skipped a beat when he saw it. He returned to his old life, gathering herbs, fixing tools, and trading small things in the nearby village. People often asked him why he looked toward the sky so often. He only smiled and said, "Just checking the weather." But deep down he was waiting. He didn't know what for. Maybe a sound. Maybe a sign. Maybe her months turned into years. Seasons changed. The snow came and melted, and the trees grew new leaves again. The man grew older, his hair now mixed with streaks of silver. His hands were rougher, slower than before. But every time he climbed the mountain paths, he still remembered where she had once rested. The place where the dragon had healed was now quiet and green. Grass grew over the stones, and the marks her claws had left on the ground had begun to fade. Yet when he stood there, he could still feel something in the air, a faint heat like the memory of fire. Sometimes he sat on that same rock and talked softly, as if she were still there listening. "I hope you're flying somewhere safe," he would say. "I hope your wing doesn't hurt anymore." He would look up at the clouds and smile. "You know, the valley feels empty without you." He didn't tell anyone about those moments. It was his secret, a quiet bond between him and the creature he once saved. The world had moved on, but that memory stayed alive in his heart. Over the years, the villagers began to forget the story. Children who had once been afraid of the mountains grew up never hearing about the dragon at all. When the man mentioned her, they laughed softly and said, "Old stories." Nothing more. He didn't argue. He just smiled, because he knew what he had seen. He had looked into those golden eyes, seen life and pain and trust, something no story could ever describe. Still, as time went on, he began to feel the weight of loneliness again. The dragon had given him purpose when she needed him, and when she left, that purpose went with her. Sometimes when he worked in the forest, he would hear the wind rush through the trees and think it was her wings. He would stop, look around, and then sigh when he saw nothing. One night during a heavy storm, he sat by the window, watching lightning flash across the sky. Rain poured hard and thunder rolled over the mountains. For a brief second he thought he heard something else, a deep, familiar roar hidden in the sound of the storm. His heart jumped, but when he ran outside there was only darkness and rain. Still, that sound stayed with him. He couldn't tell if it was real or a memory, but it filled him with warmth. Maybe she remembers me, he whispered to himself, smiling under the rain. As the years passed, his steps grew slower. The walk to the mountain became harder, but he never stopped going. It was his place of peace, the only place that reminded him he had once done something good, something that truly mattered. He didn't think of himself as a hero. He never told anyone about what he had done. He didn't need praise or reward. All he cared about was that she had lived. That was enough. Sometimes, when the night sky was clear, he would sit outside his cabin and stare at the stars. He liked to imagine her flying among them, a shadow passing across the moon, her wings stretching wide and free. He would whisper, "I hope you're still flying strong." One evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky golden pink, he stood by the river thinking of her again. The reflection of the clouds on the water looked almost like wings spread wide. He smiled faintly and said, "You're probably somewhere far away now. Maybe you've forgotten me." But then, as if in answer, a soft gust of warm wind swept past him. It carried a faint smell, like smoke, sweet and familiar. His heart stopped for a second. He looked up quickly at the horizon, but the sky was quiet. Still, that warmth stayed on his skin long after the wind had passed. He didn't know if it was real, but deep down he believed it was her. Maybe she had flown by. Maybe she still remembered. That night he slept with peace in his heart. He dreamt of the dragon, flying high above the clouds, her scales shining like stars, her eyes gentle and full of life. In the dream, she looked down at him and made a soft sound, not fierce or loud, just calm, the same sound she had made when she first trusted him. He woke up smiling. Life went on. Seasons continued to change. The man grew older, but the memory of the dragon never faded. It stayed with him like a quiet flame, small but steady, burning softly in the background of his days. Sometimes, when people asked him if he believed in dragons, he would say yes, but not the kind you read about. The real ones. They're different. They can feel. They can remember. He never said more than that. The villagers thought he was speaking in riddles, just an old man talking to himself. But he didn't mind, because in his heart he knew the truth. He had saved a dragon once, the deadliest creature the world had ever feared. And though she had flown away long ago, he could still feel her presence in every gust of wind, every flash of lightning, and every shadow that passed across the mountains. He didn't know it yet, but the story wasn't over. The bond he had created that day, between a fragile human and a mighty dragon, would return to him in a way more powerful and beautiful than he could ever imagine. For now, he just smiled at the sky and whispered softly, "Wherever you are, I hope you're safe." And somewhere far beyond the clouds, in a hidden world of mountains and mist, a dragon with golden eyes flew through the star, and for a brief moment, she turned her head toward the valley below, as if she, too, remembered the man who had once saved her life. Many years had passed since the dragon had flown away. The man had grown older now. His hair had turned white and his hands shook a little when he worked. But even with time changing everything around him, one thing stayed the same. He still looked toward the mountains every morning. The valley had changed too. The trees had grown taller, and a small river now ran through the field behind his cabin. The villagers rarely visited him anymore, though sometimes they came to buy herbs or tools. They often spoke about how the old man still lived alone, always looking at the sky as if waiting for something that would never return. They didn't understand that he was waiting. He didn't expect much. Just one more glimpse, one sound, anything that could tell him she was still out there. Sometimes, when the wind blew strong, he would close his eyes and imagine her wings cutting through the air above him. He could almost hear the sound of them, deep and heavy like thunder rolling softly in the clouds. It made him smile every time. But as the years went on, those sounds never came. He began to think maybe she had moved far away, beyond the mountains where the air was thin and wild. Maybe she had found a new home, a place where dragons lived free. He wanted to believe that. Then one night something strange happened. The day had been calm, but by evening dark clouds began to gather over the mountains. The wind grew stronger, and flashes of lightning spread across the sky. The man watched from his window, listening to the thunder echo between the peaks. Storms weren't new in the valley. He had lived through hundreds, but this one felt different. The sound of the thunder carried something deeper, almost alive. Then, in the middle of the roaring sky, he heard a sound that made his heart freeze. It wasn't thunder, it was a roar, deep, powerful, familiar. He rushed outside without thinking, the rain soaking his clothes instantly. The night sky was wild, lightning tearing through clouds, wind howling through the trees. But above all that noise, he heard it again, a roar that came from the sky. He looked up, and for a moment he saw nothing but dark clouds and flashes of light. Then one flash lit up the entire valley, and in that split second he saw it, a massive shadow gliding through the clouds, wings stretched wide. His breath caught. His heart pounded hard in his chest. "It can't be," he whispered. But deep inside, he already knew it was her. The shadow moved closer, breaking through the storm clouds. Rain poured down harder as the creature descended, circling the valley like a dark storm itself. Then she came into full view, larger, stronger, and even more magnificent than he remembered. Her scales glowed faintly each time lightning flashed, reflecting silver, blue, and gold. The dragon. She landed near the same cliff where she had once been wounded, her massive claws digging into the wet ground. The impact shook the earth, but this time there was no fear in the man's heart. Only awe, only joy. He stood in the rain, frozen in disbelief. For years he had dreamed of this moment. He had imagined her return countless times, but reality felt far more powerful. The dragon turned her head slowly and looked straight at him. Her golden eyes were the same, filled with warmth and memory. She let out a deep rumble, softer than before, almost like a greeting. The man couldn't move for a few seconds. Then he took a slow step forward, his feet sinking into the wet soil. "You came back," he said quietly, his voice trembling. Lightning flashed again, and that's when he saw something else. Behind her, in the shadows of the storm, moved two smaller figures. At first he thought they were illusions, tricks of the light. But when one of them let out a high-pitched cry, he realized they were real. Two smaller dragons, much younger, with wings not yet as wide, their scales bright and new. The old man's mouth parted in amazement. You have little ones?" The mother dragon lowered her head slightly as if acknowledging his words. The two young dragons peeked from behind her, curious and cautious. They were beautiful. Their scales shimmered with soft colors, and their eyes glowed faintly in the dim light. They looked at him not with fear, but with wonder. The old man stood completely still, tears mixing with the rain on his face. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. The dragon he once saved, the fierce creature who had once been broken and bleeding, had returned to him, and she wasn't alone. The storm began to ease slowly. The thunder faded and the clouds started to clear, leaving a pale moon shining above. The dragon stepped forward, her movement slow and graceful despite her size. She stopped a few feet away from him. He could feel the warmth of her breath even in the cool night air. For a long time, they just looked at each other. No words, no sounds, just the quiet understanding of two beings who shared a bond stronger than time. Then she made a sound, a low, deep hum that filled the valley. It wasn't like her roars of power. This was softer, almost melodic. It felt like a message, something old and meaningful. The smaller dragons echoed her sound, their voices lighter and higher. The valley filled with their harmonized calls, echoing beautifully across the mountains. The old man felt something stir inside him, a peace he hadn't felt in years. He slowly raised his hand again, the same way he had done the first time he met her. The dragon lowered her head toward him, her eyes glowing softly. He placed his hand gently on her scale, the same one he had once touched when she was hurt. It was warm and alive, and for a moment everything around them disappeared. The storm, the years, the loneliness. Only that moment existed. "You didn't forget," he whispered. His voice broke with emotion. "You remembered." The dragon blinked slowly, her breath rolling gently across him like a warm wind. The smaller dragons came closer, curious, but careful. One of them sniffed at the man's coat, while the other looked up at him with wide, shining eyes. He smiled, overwhelmed. "So these are your children," he said softly. "They're beautiful." The mother dragon let out another soft rumble like a proud reply. The man stood there for a long time, watching them. The moonlight bathed the valley in a silver glow, making the moment feel almost unreal. It was as if the heavens themselves had opened just to witness their reunion. The dragon lifted her head and looked toward the mountains, then back at him again. She gave a short, deep sound, something between a growl and a sigh. He didn't understand the meaning, but he felt it. It was like she was saying thank you. Then slowly she spread her wings again. The two smaller dragons followed her movement, imitating her like children learning to walk. The old man stepped back as the ground trembled beneath their power. He knew she wasn't here to stay. She had a world to return to, a world beyond the mountains where creatures like her belonged. But she had come back. She had remembered. She had shown him something no human would ever believe. Before she took off, she looked at him one last time. The wind blew hard as she gave a final, gentle roar, not fierce but full of meaning. A farewell, a promise. The old man raised his hand again and whispered, "Fly safe, my friend." With that, she leapt into the air, her wings spreading wide, catching the moonlight as she soared upward. The two young dragons followed her closely, their smaller wings beating fast. Together they circled above the valley once, just like she had done years ago, before disappearing into the endless sky. The old man watched until they were gone, his heart full but calm. The night felt alive again. The air still carried the warmth of her presence, and for the first time in many years he didn't feel alone. He walked back to his cabin slowly, soaked and tired, but smiling. He sat by the window looking at the sky where she had vanished and whispered softly, "You came back, and you brought life with you." Outside, the rain had stopped. The stars shone brighter than ever, and somewhere in the distance, the faint echo of a dragon's call lingered, a sound that promised that this wasn't the end, but the beginning of something even greater. And as he closed his eyes that night, he felt peace, the kind of peace that only comes when kindness returns to you even after years of silence. The next few days after the dragon's return felt unreal to the old man. Every sound in the valley reminded him of that night, the thunder, the beating wings, the glowing eyes that had looked at him with recognition and warmth. He couldn't stop thinking about it. He replayed every moment in his mind, the way she had landed, the way her children had peeked out from behind her wings, and the way she had looked at him before flying away again. It all felt like a dream, yet it was real. He had seen it with his own eyes. Each morning he went out to the same cliff just in case she might return again. He brought food, not because he thought dragons ate the same things as humans, but because it felt like a gesture, a quiet way to say, "You are welcome here any time." Days turned into weeks, and though she didn't return immediately, something inside him had changed. The loneliness that used to sit heavy in his chest was gone. It had been replaced with a soft peace, like the feeling after a long storm finally ends. He didn't need proof anymore. He knew she was alive. He knew she remembered him, and that was enough. But life has a strange way of surprising those who least expect it. One cold morning, as mist covered the valley, the old man went out to gather water from the stream behind his cabin. He noticed something unusual near the big rock where the dragon had once rested. The grass there was bent, the soil freshly disturbed, as if something large had been there again. At first he thought maybe it was an animal, but when he looked closer, his eyes widened in disbelief. In the middle of the flattened grass was something that shimmered faintly in the soft morning light. He stepped closer, his hands trembling. It looked like a giant scale, smooth, round, and silver blue, almost like glass. It was warm to the touch, as if it held life within it. He lifted it carefully and held it up to the light. It glowed softly, catching every color of the sunrise. A strange emotion filled his heart, part joy, part wonder. "She was here," he whispered. She came back. He looked around, hoping to see her in the sky, but the air was silent. Only the soft rustle of trees and the whispering wind. He clutched the scale close to his chest and smiled. It wasn't just a sign. It was a gift. He didn't know why she left it there, but deep down he understood. It was her way of saying thank you. Over the next few weeks, strange and beautiful things began to happen in the valley. The plants started growing faster and stronger. Flowers bloomed even though it wasn't the right season. The river water became clearer, shimmering like crystal when the sun hit it. Even the animals seemed more at peace. Deer walked closer to the cabin, birds sang louder, and everything felt alive. It was as if the dragon's presence had left a blessing behind. The old man kept the scale inside his cabin, placing it carefully on a wooden table near the window. Sometimes at night it would glow softly, filling the room with a calming blue light. He would sit beside it just watching the glow, feeling warmth in his heart. But that wasn't the only gift she had left. One evening, as he was fixing a broken fence near the edge of the forest, he heard something, a low, familiar sound like a distant hum. He froze and listened closely. The sound came again, clearer this time. He turned toward the hills, and there, standing between the trees, was one of the smaller dragons. It was one of her offspring. The young dragon was about the size of a horse, its scales shining faintly under the setting sun. It looked at him curiously, its head tilted slightly. It wasn't afraid. It wasn't angry. It was calm. The old man slowly dropped the tools from his hands and took a step forward. "Hey there," he said softly. "You came back too?" The young dragon blinked, making a low, soft growl that almost sounded like a reply. It took a few steps closer, its movements careful but confident. The man stayed still, letting it come to him. When it was close enough, he could feel the warmth of its breath and hear the faint rumble in its chest, like a cat's purr but deeper. He raised his hand slowly, showing he meant no harm. The dragon leaned forward and pressed its snout gently against his palm. For a moment, time stopped. The same connection he had once shared with the mother dragon now passed to her child. He could feel trust. He could feel memory. Maybe she had told her offspring about the human who had helped her long ago. Maybe this young one had come to see that human for itself. The dragon stayed with him for a while, walking around the field, sniffing at the plants, watching the birds. It seemed fascinated by everything. The old man laughed softly, a kind of laugh he hadn't made in years. He talked to it as if it could understand every word. He told it about the valley, about the time he first met its mother, and about how he had waited all those years just to see her again. The dragon listened quietly, tilting its head now and then, making soft noises. Before sunset, it looked up at the sky, spread its wings, and gave a short cry, a sound that echoed through the valley. Then with one powerful leap, it took off into the air. The man watched it fly high, his eyes filled with both joy and longing. That night, when he returned to his cabin, the scale on his table glowed brighter than ever, the room filled with soft blue light, and for the first time in many years, the old man felt truly at peace. From that day onward, the young dragon began to visit often. It never stayed too long, just enough to sit near him while he worked or glide low over the valley as if checking on him. It seemed to trust him completely. Sometimes it brought things, shiny stones, feathers, or pieces of crystal it found near the mountains. The man didn't know what to do with them, so he kept them all in a small wooden box. He called it the dragon's treasure, though he knew the real treasure was the friendship that had formed between them. The villagers began to notice strange lights in the sky again. They whispered about the dragon of the valley returning. Some were afraid, but others saw the peace in the old man's eyes and began to believe the dragon was a protector, not a danger. Seasons passed, and the visits continued. The young dragon grew bigger, stronger, and wiser. It began hunting on its own, flying high above the clouds, but it never forgot the man. Every few weeks it returned, always landing in the same spot, always greeting him with a soft growl and a gentle touch of its snout. The bond between them grew deeper. It was no longer just about kindness or gratitude. It was about friendship, pure and silent, the kind that didn't need words to be understood. Sometimes at night, the man would see 3 figures flying across the moon, the mother dragon and her 2 grown offspring. They would circle the valley once, leaving trails of silver light behind them. It became their silent promise that no matter how far they went, they would always come back. One winter, when snow covered the ground and the air was cold enough to freeze breath, the old man fell ill. His body had grown weak and he could no longer walk far from his cabin. Yet even in his sickness, he still looked out the window every morning, waiting for a glimpse of the sky he loved so much. Then one night, as the snow fell softly outside, he heard a deep, familiar sound. He turned his head slowly toward the window. There, through the falling snow, he saw it, a massive shape landing gently in front of his cabin. The snow blew around it like white fire. The dragon had come. She had returned again, this time not to thank him, not to bring gifts, but to be near him. The ground trembled softly as she lowered her head to the window, her golden eyes shining through the glass. Inside, the man smiled weakly, tears filling his eyes. "You came," he whispered, his voice faint but full of love. The dragon rumbled softly, a sound that vibrated through the cabin walls. It was the same sound she had made years ago when he first touched her wounded wing. The same warmth, the same peace. Outside, her 2 children stood beside her, their eyes glowing softly in the snowlight. The 3 dragons surrounded the cabin quietly, their presence filling the valley with calm. Inside, the man closed his eyes, a peaceful smile on his face. The sound of their breathing was the last thing he heard before drifting into a deep, calm sleep. And that night, as the snow covered the world in white silence, the dragons stayed beside him, their wings forming a shelter, their warmth melting the cold around his small cabin. It was their way of saying thank you one last time, for kindness, for courage, for friendship that had crossed the line between human and creature. The valley was quiet that morning. Snow covered everything like a white blanket, soft and peaceful. The trees stood still, their branches heavy with frost, and the air carried a silence that only winter can bring. Inside the small cabin, the fire had burned down to glowing embers. The old man lay on his bed, his face calm, a faint smile resting on his lips. His eyes were closed, and he looked like someone who had finally found rest after a long journey. Outside, the 3 dragons stood silently around the cabin. The mother dragon, the same one he had once saved from death, lowered her head close to the window, her golden eyes glowing softly. Her 2 grown offspring stood beside her, their wings folded neatly, watching quietly. None of them moved for a long time. The snow fell on their backs, melting instantly against their warm scales. They didn't roar. They didn't fly. They just stayed there as if the silence itself was part of their farewell. The mother dragon made a soft, deep sound. Not a cry of sorrow, but something gentler. It was like a song, low and full of emotion, echoing across the valley. The other 2 dragons joined her, their voices blending together in harmony. The sound rose and fell like waves carrying through the mountains, reaching far beyond the frozen trees. It was their final tribute. The song of gratitude. The sound reached the nearby village, where people came out of their homes, looking toward the mountains. They saw the faint glow of the dragon's light through the mist and snow. No one was afraid anymore. They all knew what it meant. The story of the Dragon Guardian, as they had begun calling the old man, had spread among them for years. They whispered his name with respect and spoke of how his kindness had changed something deep in the world. Back in the valley, as dawn slowly touched the horizon, the dragons raised their heads to the sky. The first light of morning reflected on their scales, making them shimmer like liquid gold. The mother dragon looked one last time through the window, her eyes soft and full of warmth. Then she stepped back slowly, spreading her wings wide. The 2 younger dragons followed her lead. The air trembled as they beat their wings, sending snow swirling into the air like glittering dust. They didn't roar as they took off. They simply rose into the sky, graceful and silent, until they became nothing more than 3 shining figures disappearing into the morning clouds. The valley was still again. Only the wind whispered through the trees, carrying the memory of their song. Many days passed before the villagers gathered the courage to travel up the valley. When they finally reached the old cabin, they found it peaceful, untouched and strangely warm despite the cold air outside. Inside, the man lay as if sleeping, his hand resting near a glowing object on the table, the silver-blue dragon scale. Even after all those years, the scale still shimmered softly, giving off a gentle light that filled the room. The villagers didn't understand what it was, but they could feel something special about it, a kind of quiet magic that made them lower their voices and stand still. They buried the man near the cliff where he had once met the wounded dragon. From that spot, the view stretched wide across the valley, and when the wind blew, it carried the faint echo of distant wings. The villagers built a small stone marker there. They didn't carve fancy words or stories into it, only a simple line that read, "He was kind, and kindness never dies." As years went by, the valley became known as Dragon's Rest. Travelers came from far away to see it, to stand where a man and a dragon had once shared something beyond understanding. Many claimed that on clear nights when the moon was full, they could see glowing shapes flying high above the mountains, silent, graceful, and surrounded by faint trails of light. No one ever doubted what they were. They were the dragons, the mother and her children, returning again and again to the valley of the man who had once saved one of their own. But that wasn't the end of his story. One spring morning, long after the snow had melted, something extraordinary happened. A young shepherd boy from the village was tending his goats near the same stream that ran behind the old man's cabin. As he walked by, he noticed something sparkling near the water's edge. Curious, he went closer. Half buried in the grass was a small, round object, smooth, shiny, and faintly glowing under the sunlight. He picked it up carefully. It was a scale, smaller than the one the villagers had seen before, but glowing with the same soft blue light. When the boy held it, he felt warmth spread through his hand, and for a moment, he thought he heard a sound, faint, distant, almost like a deep hum carried on the wind. He looked up at the sky, but it was empty. Still, the feeling stayed with him, a sense of peace, of safety. He tucked the scale into his pocket and ran back to the village to show everyone what he had found. The elders examined it carefully. Some said it was a gift. Others believed it was a sign, a message that the dragons were still watching over the valley, protecting it as the old man once protected them. From that day on, the villagers began to care for the valley differently. They planted trees near the stream. They built small shelters for travelers. They made sure no one hunted the wild animals that lived there. It became a sacred place, a symbol of peace between humans and nature. Every year, on the day the man had passed away, they gathered by the stone marker on the cliff. They brought flowers and candles, and when the sun set, they lit lanterns and released them into the sky. The lights floated upward, hundreds of them, glowing softly against the night. And sometimes, as the lanterns rose, people would gasp and point, because far above, in the faint silver light of the moon, they would see 3 glowing shapes flying together. The dragons had not forgotten. They never would. Generations passed. The story became a legend, told from one age to another. Children grew up hearing about the man who healed a dragon's wing, the friendship that followed, and the day the dragons sang their song of farewell. Many believed it was just a tale, a myth to teach kindness. But others knew the truth. They had seen the lights. They had heard the low hum echoing across the valley on quiet nights. And if anyone ever stayed long enough in Dragon's Rest, they would notice something else. The plants grew greener there. The animals were gentler. The river sparkled in strange colors when the sun set. It was as if the land itself carried a blessing, the lasting memory of a promise kept. One day, far in the future, a traveler came to the valley. He had heard of the story since childhood and wanted to see the place for himself. When he reached the old cabin, now covered with vines, he felt something unexplainable, a deep calm, as if the air itself remembered every detail of what had once happened there. He sat by the cliff as the sun dipped below the mountains. The sky turned orange, then pink, then deep purple. Just as he was about to leave, he heard something, a faint rush of air above him. He looked up. 3 shapes glided silently across the darkening sky, wings shining softly in the fading light. They didn't roar or make noise. They just moved like shadows made of light. The traveler stood frozen, his heart pounding. He knew what he was seeing. The dragons had returned, still watching, still guarding, still remembering. They circled the valley once, slow and graceful, before disappearing behind the mountains. But even after they were gone, their faint glow lingered in the sky, like stars refusing to fade. The traveler smiled to himself and whispered, the story was true after all. And as he walked down the path back to the village, he could still hear the soft echo of wings behind him, gentle, powerful, eternal. In the end, the valley remained untouched by time. The flowers kept blooming. The water stayed clear. The wind carried whispers of gratitude, and though the man was long gone, his kindness lived on, in the dragons that still flew above, in the people who still spoke his name, and in the peace that filled every corner of the land he once called home. Because true kindness once given never fades. It echoes through time, in hearts, in memories, and sometimes in the wings of a dragon that never forgets.